The day I came home and found a racetrack carved through my family's farm, I honestly thought I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Then I saw my irrigation markers sticking out of a mud pit like broken bones, and that's when I realized something much worse had happened. Somebody hadn't just damaged my land, they decided it belonged to them. My name is Mason Reed, and for most of my life, I've worked a farm called Cedar Creek Produce outside a little town in South Carolina. Nothing glamorous about it. No tourist attractions, no fancy winery, no wedding venue. Just vegetables, long days, and dirt that had fed 4 generations of my family. My grandfather bought the first section of that property after coming home from Korea. My dad expanded it little by little whenever he could afford another parcel. By the time it reached me, the farm wasn't just land anymore. It was a family timeline. Every fence post had a story attached to it. Every field had memories buried somewhere underneath it. Now, if you've spent enough time in rural America, you know there are rules that don't need to be written down. One of the biggest is simple. You respect property lines. You stay on your side. I stay on mine. Most people understand that. Then again, most people aren't like Trevor Kane. The first time I met Trevor, he pulled into my driveway in a black-lifted pickup that looked like it cost more than my first house. He stepped out wearing mirrored sunglasses and expensive boots that somehow looked brand new despite him claiming to be an outdoorsman. He introduced himself as the owner of Carolina Thunder Events, a company that organized off-road racing competitions across the Southeast. Right away, I knew exactly what kind of man he was. The type who could walk through a forest and only see lumber. The type who could stand on farmland and only see future revenue. He spent 20 minutes talking about sponsorship deals, spectator attendance, media exposure, vendor opportunities, and economic growth. I spent most of that conversation staring at a tomato fields behind him and wondering how many more minutes it would take before he got to the point. Eventually he did. He wanted to lease part of my land for a motorsports expansion project. I told him no. Not maybe, not let's discuss it later, just no. He smiled. That should have worried me more than it did. Most people frown when they hear no. Trevor smiled like he had heard something completely different. As he climbed back into his truck, he said, "Well, people change their minds all the time, Mason." I laughed. Not this one. He laughed too. But looking back now, I think we were laughing about 2 entirely different things. For the next few months, life returned to normal. Planting season was moving along. We were negotiating distribution contracts. I attended a series of agricultural conferences across the state because our cooperative was exploring several new supply agreements. The travel wasn't unusual. Every year there were stretches where I spent weeks away handling business. That spring happened to be one of them. I was gone just under 10 weeks, long enough to miss home, long enough to look forward to seeing the farm again, and apparently long enough for somebody to completely lose their mind. I still remember that drive back. You know that feeling when you're finally heading home after a long trip. Everything starts feeling familiar. The roads, the trees, the little landmarks nobody else notices. I was maybe 10 minutes from the farm when I started smiling without even realizing it. Then I reached the final bend, and the smile disappeared. At first, I thought I was seeing construction runoff, fresh dirt, heavy equipment tracks, maybe a drainage project, something temporary. But the closer I got, the less sense it made. The ground looked wrong, not damaged, changed. There were elevated berms where crop rows should have been, deep trenches, standing pools of muddy water, wide carved lanes cutting across the landscape. I slowed down, then stopped completely. For several seconds I just sat there staring through the windshield. My brain refused to process what my eyes were showing me, because sitting in the middle of my farm was a fully built off-road racing complex. Not a worksite, not a proposal, not survey flags, an actual racetrack. Finished, operational, real. I got out of the truck and walked toward it. The closer I got, the worse everything looked. 12 acres, maybe more, bulldozed, reshaped, excavated. The soil profile we'd spent years protecting had been ripped apart. Drainage channels redirected. Topsoil displaced. Entire sections of productive farmland transformed into mud pits and spectator areas. I remember standing there with my hands on my hips thinking maybe there was some explanation I hadn't heard yet. Maybe somebody made a mistake. Maybe the county mixed up parcels. Maybe there was paperwork somewhere. Anything. Because the alternative was too ridiculous to believe. Then I saw the sign, Carolina Thunder Raceway. Grand opening weekend, hosted by Trevor Kane. And just like that, every remaining doubt disappeared. I called him immediately. He answered on the second ring. Sounded happy. Actually happy, like we were business partners checking in before an event. "Mason," he said. "You finally made it back." I didn't even respond to that. I said, "Why is there a racetrack on my farm?" There was a pause. Then he chuckled, a genuine chuckle, like I had asked something amusing. "Mason, relax. Everything's approved." Approved. I still remember that word. Approved. I still remember that word. Approved. I looked around at destroyed fields, buried irrigation systems, and earth-moving damage that would take years to repair. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. "Approved by who?" "The county." "No," I said. "Who approved building on my property?" His tone changed slightly, not nervous, annoyed, like I was creating unnecessary complications. "Our contractors verified everything." "It's my land, Trevor." Another pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Well, boundaries aren't always as clear as people think. Now here's the thing. Confusion sounds different than confidence. Mistakes sound different than excuses. And in that moment I realized Trevor wasn't confused. He genuinely believed he was right. Or maybe he'd convinced himself he was, which somehow made the situation even worse. I hung up without saying another word. Then I stood there looking across what used to be one of the most productive sections of my farm. A red-tailed hawk was circling overhead. The wind was moving through what little vegetation remained around the edges. And somewhere in the distance I could already hear engines. The racetrack wasn't just built, it was operating. People were actively using it. That was the moment something cold settled into my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something heavier. Because I suddenly understood this wasn't going to be solved with a phone call. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a disagreement. It was a collision between two completely different ideas of ownership. And before the week was over, I was about to learn just how far Trevor Kane had gone to convince himself those 12 acres belonged to him. The next morning, I called the one person I trusted when it came to land disputes, a surveyor named Grant Holloway. Grant wasn't the kind of guy who impressed people at parties. He drove an old truck that looked permanently dusty, drank terrible gas station coffee, and somehow knew more about property lines than most attorneys I'd ever met. He had surveyed our farm 3 separate times over the years. If anyone could tell me whether I was losing my mind, it was Grant. When I explained what happened, he got unusually quiet. That should have been my first warning. Normally Grant had an opinion on everything. But after I finished talking, he simply said, "Don't touch anything yet. Give me 24 hours. The next day we met at the western boundary of the farm. The sun was already brutal. Heat waves shimmered above the dirt road while Grant unloaded enough GPS equipment to make it look like NASA had arrived. For nearly 3 hours he worked without saying much, checking markers, comparing coordinates, reviewing historical records, walking lines that had existed longer than either of us had been alive. I mostly followed behind him, trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. Eventually he stopped, removed his hat, and stared toward the racetrack. Then he looked at me. "Mason," he said. That was it, just my name, the kind of delivery that tells you the next sentence won't be good. "What?" He pointed toward the track. "They didn't cross the line." For 1 second I actually felt relieved. Then he finished. "They obliterated it." I stared at him. Grant opened a tablet and showed me the overlays. Original property boundaries, county records, current construction footprint. The racetrack wasn't barely over the line. It wasn't partially over the line. Large sections sat nearly a quarter mile inside my property. A quarter mile. Not feet, not inches. A quarter mile. I remember blinking at the screen because the numbers looked ridiculous. The kind of mistake that shouldn't happen. The kind of mistake too large to be accidental. Grant zoomed in further. The deeper we looked, the uglier it became. Parking areas, drainage systems, several spectator zones, permanent structures, all sitting inside land legally owned by my family. When he finished explaining everything, I asked the question that had been bouncing around inside my head since the day I got home. How does this happen? Grant took a long sip of coffee, then shrugged. It doesn't. That answer bothered me more than anything else. Because mistakes happen. People make bad measurements. Survey stakes get moved. Records get misread. But this wasn't that. This looked like somebody had decided verification was optional. Within 48 hours, Grant completed a formal survey package. The documentation was airtight. Coordinates, historical maps, boundary certifications, everything. Then I hired an attorney, a woman named Rachel Monroe. Now, Rachel was interesting because she grew up on a cattle ranch herself, which meant she spoke both languages. She understood farmers, and she understood courtrooms. After reviewing the survey, she leaned back in her chair and said something that made me feel slightly better. "This is one of the cleanest property cases I've seen in years." I laughed. "That doesn't sound reassuring." "It is," she said. "The facts are on your side." Then she paused. "But people with money don't usually surrender when facts show up." That turned out to be the most accurate prediction of the entire situation. The formal notice went out 3 days later. Trevor received copies. His company received copies. Their attorneys received copies. Everyone was officially informed that the racetrack occupied private farmland they did not own. And that's when things got weird. Instead of apologizing, Trevor doubled down. His legal team responded with a stack of paperwork thick enough to stop a bullet. Environmental reviews, construction permits, economic impact studies, traffic assessments, marketing investments, financial projections, page after page after page. Rachel looked through all of it. Then she pushed the stack aside. "None of this matters." "What do you mean?" She tapped the survey map. "You can have permits to build a skyscraper. That doesn't give you permission to build it in somebody else's living room." That was the first time I laughed in weeks. Unfortunately, Trevor wasn't laughing. A few days later, he called me directly. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wishes I hadn't, because the conversation revealed exactly who he really was. He started politely enough, talked about investments, growth opportunities, community benefits, the usual stuff. Then he made an offer, the land swap. I actually thought I misheard him. A what? A land exchange. I waited. Surely there had to be more. "There are parcels east of the highway," he continued. "We could work something out." I looked out the window toward fields my grandfather had worked. Fields my father had worked. Fields I'd spent half my life trying to improve. Then I said, "You destroyed part of my farm and now you're offering me different land?" His voice tightened. "Mason, let's be practical." Practical. Funny word. People love using it when they're asking somebody else to absorb the consequences. I told him no. Again, not maybe. Let's negotiate. No. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Trevor finally dropped the friendly act. "You realize how much money is tied up in this project?" I remember smiling. Not because it was funny, because I finally understood the problem. Trevor had spent so much money convincing himself he was right that he could no longer afford to admit he was wrong. And those are dangerous people. I said, "That's not my problem." Then I hung up. The lawsuit moved forward shortly afterward. Court dates were scheduled. Evidence was exchanged. Depositions began. Everything started moving through the system. And if you've never been involved in a civil property case, let me save you some suspense. Nothing happens quickly. Weeks passed, then more weeks. The legal machinery kept grinding forward while life continued around it, at least for everyone except me, because every weekend the racetrack remained open. Every single weekend, hundreds of people showed up. Trucks, ATVs, spectators, food vendors, music, announcements, social media promotions, the whole thing. And every time I drove near that section of the farm, I felt the same knot forming in my stomach, not because of the noise, because of the normality. That's what bothered me most. The fact that everyone involved acted like this was perfectly normal, as if repeating something long enough could somehow transform it into reality. One Saturday evening, I parked on a ridge overlooking the property. The sun was setting behind the track. Dust floated through golden light. Engines echoed across the fields. People were laughing, having fun, creating memories. Meanwhile, beneath those tires sat soil my family had spent decades building. I sat there for nearly an hour, just watching, trying to understand how two completely different versions of reality could exist at the same time. Down below, they saw entertainment. I saw theft. Neither side appeared willing to move. A few days later, my neighbor Earl stopped by. Earl was in his 70s and had forgotten more about farming than most people ever learn. We sat on the porch drinking coffee. Eventually, he looked toward the track and said, "You know what scares me about this?" "What?" "It worked. It worked." I frowned. "What worked?" He pointed toward the distant noise. "They built it." That answer sat with me. Because he wasn't talking about legal ownership. He was talking about psychology. People tend to accept whatever already exists. If something gets built, people assume it belongs there. If something stays standing long enough, they stop questioning how it got there. And Trevor understood that better than most. Every day the track remained operational, made it feel more permanent, more established, more real. Maybe that was the strategy, maybe not, but it was working. Then finally the court date arrived. Rachel and I drove into the county courthouse before sunrise. I barely slept the night before, not because I was afraid we'd lose, because I was exhausted from waiting, exhausted from explaining, exhausted from watching somebody profit from damage they caused. The hearing itself wasn't dramatic at first, mostly paperwork, testimony, survey evidence, technical discussions. Then Grant took the stand, and everything changed. For nearly 2 hours he walked the court through every measurement, every marker, every historical record, piece by piece, methodically, carefully, leaving no room for interpretation, no room for confusion, no room for excuses. When he finished, the courtroom felt different. Even Trevor's attorneys seemed less confident. Then the judge began reviewing the exhibits, one map after another, one overlay after another, one photograph after another. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Trevor looked nervous. Not frustrated, not annoyed, nervous, because reality was finally catching up. And before that day was over, the judge was about to make a decision that would change everything. By the time the judge returned to the courtroom, you could feel the tension sitting in the air. Nobody was talking much. Papers stopped shuffling. Even the usual courthouse noise seemed quieter somehow. The judge adjusted his glasses, reviewed a few notes, then looked directly at the survey maps spread across the front table. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. In fact, it was probably the calmest moment of the entire case. The property boundary is clearly established. That was the first sentence. Then came the second. There is no reasonable ambiguity regarding ownership. I remember looking across the room toward Trevor. His face didn't change immediately. It happened gradually. Like someone realizing a bridge they've been walking across isn't actually connected to the other side. The judge continued. The racetrack occupied private agricultural land owned by me. The encroachment was substantial. The evidence was overwhelming. And because of that, Trevor's company was ordered to restore the damaged acreage to its original condition within 15 days. If they failed to do so, I would be authorized to perform the restoration myself and seek reimbursement for all associated costs. That was it. Simple. Direct, clear, the kind of ruling that leaves very little room for interpretation. Walking out of the courthouse, Rachel smiled for the first time in months. Congratulations. I shrugged. It probably sounds strange, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. The ruling didn't magically repair the soil. It didn't bring back lost growing seasons. It didn't undo months of stress. It simply acknowledged reality. And after everything that had happened, that felt like enough. At least for a little while. The first week after the ruling came and went, nothing happened. No equipment, no crews, no restoration plans, nothing. The second week wasn't much better. Every morning I would drive by expecting to see some sign of compliance. Instead I saw the same thing. Vehicles, spectators, activity, business as usual. At first I thought maybe they were organizing contractors. Then I thought maybe they were waiting for permits. Then eventually I stopped making excuses for them. Because excuses were exactly what got us here in the first place. On day 13, I drove out to a ridge overlooking the property. The sound hit me before the view did. Engines, announcements, crowds. The racetrack was fully operational. Again, I sat there for several minutes watching trucks launch through mud pits built on top of my farmland. And for the first time since all this started, I wasn't angry. I was done. There's a difference. Anger wants a reaction. Being done wants a resolution. The next morning I walked into our equipment shed before sunrise. The air smelled like diesel fuel and machine grease. Sunlight leaked through cracks in the metal walls. Dust floated through the beams of light. For a moment I just stood there looking at the biggest bulldozer we owned. My father used that machine. My grandfather had operated an earlier version before him. That dozer had helped build irrigation systems, clear storm damage, and save fields after floods. It had always been used to create something. That morning it was going to erase something. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and listened to it come alive. A few of my employees arrived shortly afterward. Nobody needed much explanation. They already knew. They lived through this mess right alongside me. By 7 o'clock, we had graders, scrapers, loaders, and support equipment moving toward the racetrack. The convoy stretched down the dirt road like a slow-moving parade, except nobody was celebrating. We were simply going back to work. When we arrived, racing activities were already underway. I still can't believe that part, even now. Even after everything, the court had ruled. The deadline had expired, and somehow Trevor still believed the show would continue. I lowered the blade of the bulldozer into the first mud pit. For a second I hesitated, not because I doubted the decision, because I understood what the moment represented. Months of conflict, months of frustration, months of watching somebody else's fantasy occupy my reality. Then I pushed forward. Soil rolled ahead of the blade. Water spilled from the pit. The first section began disappearing almost immediately. And something unexpected happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't satisfying in the way movies pretend these moments are. It felt natural, like correcting a typo, like putting furniture back where it belonged, like restoring order. About an hour later, a cloud of dust appeared on the access road, then another, then several more. Trevor had arrived. His truck stopped so aggressively I thought he might damage it. The door flew open. He jumped out already, yelling. I couldn't hear the words over the machinery at first, but I didn't need to. His body language said enough. I shut down the dozer and timed out. The sudden silence felt enormous. Trevor stormed toward me, his face red, his hands waving. "You've lost your mind!" I glanced toward the partially filled pit behind me, then back at him, warning Trevor. That didn't help. "What do you think you're doing?" I actually laughed, not because I wanted to provoke him, because the question itself felt absurd. What does it look like? You're destroying the track. There it was, that word. Destroying. As if the destruction hadn't happened months earlier. As if the damaged farmland somehow didn't count. I reached into the cab and pulled out a folded copy of the court order. Then I handed it to him. "You had 15 days. He snatched it from my hand, started reading, then rereading. The confidence he'd carried for months seemed to drain away a little more with every passing second. Meanwhile, the equipment behind me kept moving. Slowly, steadily, relentlessly, exactly the way consequences usually arrive, not all at once, piece by piece. Trevor's attorneys showed up later that afternoon. They threatened emergency motions, financial claims, business losses, future damages, every argument imaginable. The problem was simple. They were out of time. The ruling already existed, the deadline had already passed, and the restoration was already underway. By sunset, the transformation was impossible to ignore. Several major sections of the racetrack no longer existed. The giant berms were flattened, mud pits filled, access lanes erased, and the strangest part, it disappeared much faster than it had appeared, almost like the land itself wanted it gone. For the next several days we kept working, load after load, pass after pass, until eventually the final grader crossed the final section. The track was gone, not hidden. Not closed. Gone. In its place sat rough agricultural ground waiting to be restored properly. I stood there as evening settled over the property. The noise was gone. The crowds were gone. The signs were gone. For the first time in months, the farm sounded like a farm again. Just wind, birds, distant equipment, normal things, the way it should have been all along. Of course, Trevor wasn't finished. People like that rarely are. A few weeks later, he filed another lawsuit. Then another claim, then another complaint. Construction losses, lost business revenue, reputational damage, future earnings. It felt like he was throwing paperwork at reality hoping something would eventually stick. It didn't. The judge dismissed the major claims one after another. The previous ruling was too clear. The facts were too strong. And eventually Trevor's company was ordered to pay damages, restoration costs, and legal fees totaling more than $70,000. When Rachel called with the news, she sounded excited. I appreciated it, but honestly, I wasn't interested in the money anymore. A few days later, I walked across the restored acreage alone. Fresh planting preparations had already begun. The soil wasn't perfect. It would take years to fully recover, but it was alive, recovering, moving forward. I stopped near the center of the field where one of the biggest mud pits used to be. The sun was setting. A light breeze moved across the property, and for the first time in nearly a year I felt something close to peace, not because I won, because the land was finally being allowed to be what it was meant to be. Still, there's one thing I've never completely settled in my own mind. People hear this story and usually split into two groups. One side says, I did exactly what needed to be done. The court gave an order. The deadline expired. I enforced it. Simple. The other side says I should have waited longer, given them more time, allowed the system to keep working. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. If someone walked into your life, ignored your boundaries, built their dream on top of your sacrifice, then acted shocked when you took it back, how long would you wait before doing something about it? That's the question I still think about. And now I'm curious about your answer. If you were standing where I stood, looking at that bulldozer on day 16, would you have climbed into the cab? Or would you have waited? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those arguments where nobody agrees completely. And maybe that's exactly what makes it worth talking about.